My name is Heike MacKerron. Those of you who haven't met me, I'm the director of the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of our new series, Transatlantic Talks. Could not be more delighted to welcome Congressman Wexler for our first transatlantic talk here in Berlin. Congressman Wexler is the president of the Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace in Washington, D.C., and I will say a few more words about him in a minute. Before that, I want to say a few words about the series. What we want to do with these transatlantic talks is pair policymakers from one side of the Atlantic with journalists or experts from the other side of the Atlantic to have a conversation about important issues for the transatlantic community. We started the series earlier this year in Washington, D.C. with Victoria Nuland. She was followed by Derek Chollet. And we thought, let's do this in Berlin as well to see how it works. And I'm pleased to let you know that we have the next series, the next installation in the making. It will probably happen in January. It's going to be on transatlantic affairs. Today I'm also very happy to welcome Judy Dempsey of Carnegie Europe to complete the transatlantic team. These transatlantic talks are on the record. We live stream them, as you can see here with the cameras. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter by tweeting at GMFUS using the hashtag GMFTtalk. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Congressman Wexler because 2014 has been such a dramatic year for the Middle East. While we in Germany just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall, the civil war in Syria continued, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict escalated, and the Islamic State has been waging war in Iraq and beyond. 4 years after the beginning of the Arab revolutions and 3 years after the US withdrawal from Iraq, fragmentation and instability reign in the region. Let me say a few more words about our speakers. Congressman Wexler retired from the US Congress in 2010 after he representing Florida's 19th district for 7 terms as a Democrat in the House of Representatives. He has traveled on numerous delegations to the Middle East and has met with the leaders of Israel, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. And I'm sure I forgot some. While serving in Congress, he chaired the Subcommittee on Europe. He also served on the Middle East Subcommittee and the House Judiciary Committee. During the 2008 presidential campaign, he advised then Senator Barack Obama on issues related to Israel and the Middle East. Congressman Wexler was also a member of the President Obama's National Security Advisory Committee for the 2012 election campaign and the Platform Drafting Committee for the 2012 Democratic National Convention. He currently serves on a number of boards, including that of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. As one of America's premier political experts on the wider Middle East, Congressman Wexler is ideally suited to help us understand the enormous challenges that face the region in 2015. As I mentioned, Judy Dempsey is the second part of the transatlantic team. Before joining Carnegie Europe as a non-resident senior associate, Ms. Dempsey had a very distinguished career in journalism. She was a columnist for the International Herald Tribune and the paper's Germany and East European correspondent. Prior to that, she worked for the Financial Times as their diplomatic correspondent in Brussels, Vienna, Berlin, and London, and she was also the bureau chief in Jerusalem. So that's it from me. With that, I would like to turn it over to you, Ms. Dempsey, to moderate the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Heike, for a very nice, warm introduction. And it's an honor to be here, especially in a new building. And it's even more of an honor to have Congressman Wexler here. I've been following your enormous work on the Middle East for years. And when I was based in Jerusalem, you visited the place many times. I think our paths crossed there too. Now, we're all very curious why you're here. I mean, there's enough trouble spots in the world, especially in the Middle East, and clearly the Middle East is the focus of our attention. Why are you here in Berlin?
Well, I'm here because the Hotel Adlon is the best hotel in the world, and I enjoy staying there. Myself and my colleagues are here in Berlin because, quite frankly, of the essential central role that Germany plays in foreign policy in Europe. And with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as many other issues, it certainly appears that a transatlantic response is ultimately going to be required if we're going to have any degree of success. And of course, there isn't the possibility of a transatlantic unified response unless Germany is not just a willing but a leading partner. So I don't only visit Berlin, of course. Paris is essential, London is essential, Brussels is essential, but amongst equals, Berlin is the most equal.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Berlin's role in, we have to touch immediately on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because it's going through unbelievably new and even more dangerous phases. Now, Chancellor Merkel herself has had a very, how would you say it, diplomatically tough relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. And the impression is, when you talk to people in the Chancellery, that the idea of a two-state solution is very much now seriously under threat, and the Chancellor worries about this. Do you seriously believe that Germany can have any kind of influential role to play now in this new cycle of violence between Israel and the Palestinians?
Germany can play an essential role in terms of creating a helpful dynamic to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Like the United States, Germany is a strong friend of the State of Israel. I believe, like the United States, what Chancellor Merkel and the vast majority of Germans hope to see is an Israel that is a Jewish democratic state in perpetuity. I'm a Zionist. I believe deeply in a Jewish democratic state. So for me, it's not just a quest for a two-state solution, which of course is very important, but even more so, it's about ensuring a future for the state of Israel that is not just a Jewish state or not just a democratic state, but a Jewish democratic state. And I would argue that as much as the two-state solution may be in jeopardy, what is even more so in jeopardy, given the developments of the region, the Jewishness and the democratic nature of Israel is what the Israeli people must debate and must determine for themselves in terms of what course they wish to take.
Well, certainly Zionism is coming under a huge sort of verbal attacks, especially in Europe, actually. And the whole idea of Israel and the Jewish state is now being so mixed together. And what you see in Europe increasingly, I have to be very honest about this, is very much anti-Israel, which is getting quite close to anti-Semitism in Europe. From your perspective, do you worry about this?
Worry about it immensely. Both the anti-Semitic nature of some of the criticism and the anti-Israel posture that more and more people seem to be adopting. The governments, the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Germany, United States and France, United States and the United Kingdom on the issues relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's great collaboration, great cooperation. But the publics in the United States and Europe are in vastly different places. For instance, Prime Minister Netanyahu's claim, demand that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not just a conflict about borders or security or Jerusalem or refugees. What the Prime Minister says is it's a battle of historical narratives. And what the Prime Minister will argue is that until the Palestinian people accept that Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, a Jewish state, that the conflict will never be, in fact, resolved. Well, in the United States, that's not in any way a controversial topic. For the most part, everyone accepts that as being a given. Obviously, in Europe, that's a very different type of lens. So, yes, not just me, but more importantly, American leaders are deeply concerned about the sentiment that seems to be more and more widespread. Now, that's not to say that legitimate criticism of the government of Israel and its policies should be categorized always as anti-Semitic. That's not fair either. However, there is a proportionate nature of some of the, or a disproportionate nature of some of the criticism that leaves one wondering why Israel will be singled out in many instances for the types of claims that it is.
Well, I mean, you're touching on very sensitive issues here, because the Europeans and the Americans do see Israel quite differently, especially when it comes to boycotts. And the Europeans are taking a much tougher line on this. But I want to turn it around the other way. Do you think, I mean, you've been so close to the Obama administration, and previous Democratic presidents and Republicans have got their fingers seriously burnt in trying to resolve this this unbelievable conflict. But do you really seriously think that the successive administrations have done enough to actually even stop settlement building, which is one of the huge dilemmas in trying to break this deadlock?
Well, American policy relative to settlements is very similar to European policy. European policy essentially categorizes settlements as illegal. We categorize them as illegitimate. But the effect is largely the same. Now, the reaction at times to the settlements, and let's be fair to the Israeli governments in the sense that now people tend to vilify the Likud-led government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. In fairness, settlements have occurred under labor governments, under centrist governments. They have occurred under all Israeli governments. So it's not just a right-of-center issue. But the real question, I think, in fairness, is that settlements is one of, or are one of, 4 or 5 critical issues. They shouldn't be more important or less important than the other issues. And the key aspect of settlements, I would argue, it's not just that we should condemn settlements. To me, the important question is which settlements inhibit or prevent the realization of a two-state solution, which settlements inhibit or prevent the realization of a contiguous, viable Palestinian state, and which ones do not. For the ones that do not and are adjacent to the 1967 lines, well, you may disagree with them, or you may legally or morally have an opinion. But the truth of the matter is they don't inhibit a Palestinian state. For those settlements that are deep into the West Bank, that in fact prevent the viability of a contiguous Palestinian state, I would respectfully suggest that's where the energy should be driven. The problem with the European policy, with all due respect, is that the settlements are all lumped together. And from an Israeli perspective, the settlements that are just outside of the 67 lines, for instance, in the Jerusalem, in the area where Israel is annexed, for most Israelis, they view that as suburbs of Jerusalem. So when you have a policy that is viewed as being a punitive policy, and from the average Israeli, they look at it and they say, this is nuts. This is my suburbs. It doesn't work. So the European policy should be refined, I would respectfully suggest, to reflect the demographic reality on the ground.
You needn't worry about being respectful. It's okay.
Okay.
Really.
All right.
Before we could really seriously get bogged down in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as many politicians have. I just have one last question on this before we move on to the broader Middle East, because it's related to the broader Middle East. Now, there's a theory, and I think it's changing. There's been a long-held theory that the peace in the Middle East and so many regional issues was contingent upon the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think the Arab Spring changed the dynamics of this completely. Now, I was wondering, how do you see this now, given what is happening in Syria? And this is quite remarkable, actually, and thankful that so far the Golan Heights has been spared from attacks. It's very fragile. But do you see any relationship between some of the regional conflicts in the Middle East to the perpetuation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
If the Arab revolutions should have taught us anything, it's that as important and as central as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to resolve, resolution of that conflict is not going to minimize one bit Iran's quest for nuclear weapons. You could resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tomorrow, and you're not going to help the civil war in Syria one iota. You can resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tomorrow, and a legitimate government that controls all of Libya is not just going to appear. Your problems in Yemen are not going to be minimized because the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians is resolved. And the problems in Iraq, in terms of the division of Shiite and Sunni and everyone else, are not going to be resolved one way or the other because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think people need to be honest, all of us, amongst ourselves, about the rightful place of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But to me, that doesn't mean that resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is any less urgent.
Of course. Which brings us, though, to, which is why we're here, what the Europeans and Americans can do together.
Right.
So we have, as ever, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we can, that's on our list. We have IS, that's on our list. Iraq, on our list. Syria, on our list. Let's not forget Jordan. It's combustible, given how many refugees they have to take in and the fragility of the regime there. In practical terms, can the Europeans and Americans really do anything to stabilize the Middle East?
Yes. If the goal is to stabilize, then the United States, along with our European allies, principally Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, but the European Union as a whole plays a pivotal role in not being the region's policeman or being the region's bank, but it's, in fact, I would argue, the only alliance or the only group that can play that role. Is Putin going to play that role? I don't think so. Is China stepping up to the plate to play that role? Absolutely not. So when it comes to still resolving the Iranian nuclear weapon issue, for instance, who does Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states look to? They look to Europe and the United States. So the essential nature of the transatlantic relationship, while it has morphed into something very different than it was originally intended to be, possibly, is still, in my humble opinion, the critical relationship that travels throughout the world.
Before we open this out to the floor, being the devil's advocate, I wonder about this, actually, because it depends on who you speak to in the Middle East. There's huge distrust of the Americans on one side, there's huge distrust of some of the European countries the other. And you ask yourself sometimes, well, when is the region going to take care of itself?
Sure.
I mean, in all your years of dealing with this, do you throw this question out to the regional players, or is the distrust between them so deep and the legacy of distrust so deep that they need outside assistance?
Oh, clearly they need outside assistance. I mean, again, in the context of the Iranian nuclear weapon, why is Iran at the negotiation table? They're at the negotiation table because the United States and Europe, but principally Europe, got together and created a set of financial sanctions that over time had a dramatic economic effect on the Iranian regime and the Iranian people. That's why they're at the negotiation table. They're not at the negotiation table because, for the most part, of a threat from the Middle Eastern nations who've bought a whole lot of weapons from both us and from Europe. They're there because of the economic sanctions, of the transatlantic community. Take it further to Russia and Ukraine. Obviously an ongoing developing situation. But what is the strongest tool at this point that is used to minimize, hopefully reverse, Putin's aggressiveness? It's a joinder of American and European economic financial sanctions. So whether we like it or not, it's the financial cooperation of the transatlantic community that has become essentially the biggest stick that is available in the world today to create a world order that respects human rights, respects the sovereignty of nations, and gives stability to the international community.
Well, sanctions didn't work in Iraq.
Well, under whose definition?
Yours.
You're right, they didn't, in the sense that Saddam Hussein did not reverse course and military action was required. This is a whole nother discussion. And you could argue the military option didn't work so well either, and that would be a fair statement. Having said that, though, and I often find fault with those who are so critical of American policy in Iraq, we can't prove it because we didn't do it. But if the United States didn't invade Iraq, and the net result was that Saddam Hussein would have had 24 United Nations resolutions directed against him, that he ignored all of them, and then America did nothing. Well, what would that world look like? Is that a world you want to live in and I want to live in? I suspect not.
But you're raising a very important issue here, and this is the idea not of the hard power or the soft power, it's about influence.
Sure.
And it's not about regime change, it's about influencing events. And I mean, we have seen with great hesitation and criticism from both sides whether Obama's strategy of the strategic bombing against ISIS, if this is in fact going to work. I'm actually pondering, does the West really have the influence now to influence what's going on in the Middle East?
I think the answer is unquestionably yes. The question is not whether we have influence. The question is whether we have enough influence and whether we have the resources and the willpower to exert those assets that we possess. And then ultimately, of course, I think another fair question is, regardless of how much resources and assets we throw at the problem, will it be enough to resolve the situation? So that's a fair question. And I think how President Obama answers it, which is an evolution from President Bush's policy, is a realization that the United States and Europe, no matter how many resources we throw at it, will not reach anywhere near the goals that we seek unless there are built from the ground up in the local communities institutions of government, institutions of civil practice, and a willingness for locals to take responsibility. There's no doubt about that. But for those locals to take responsibility, it is required, unfortunately, for outside sources to provide opportunities.
I mean, this is a very important issue. I'd like to, I don't want to hog this discussion because we could go on for a long time about this, but I would like to open up this discussion to the floor and invite the audience to ask any questions. It's very easy. I get very tough with these questions. Only allowed one question at a time. And statements have to be incredibly short. But please feel free to ask any questions, put up your hand, identify yourself, and don't be shy. The German audiences tend to be a little bit shy sometimes, especially when there's with such a distinguished visitor like you. But I would like somebody to kick off the question, or else we can continue this conversation. But please don't hesitate. Nice to see you. I think I have a colleague, I think, an Iranian.
There's a young lady over there.
Yes, please. Oh.
I think someone else can go first, but...
Thanks.
Probably everyone can hear.
Microphone will come.
I'll just kick it off. Being an American in Germany, so I'm a little less shy. I'm Rachel Tausenfreund with the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I mean, you touched on it, but, you know, this sort of crucial question of, you know, even if Europe and the United States find the willpower to throw, you know, everything they have, or even a substantial amount of what they have, at the problems in the Middle East, let's even leave aside the problems in Europe, you know, even then maybe they can't find a solution. But, you know, but first finding the willpower is something that's very much in doubt in Europe, certainly, and has been for quite a while, not least in Germany. But one gets the sense, you know, we talk about a lot that the shift is that willpower, you know, has significantly sunk also in the States, and that would be, you know, I'd like your input on that. Is that an accurate description? Is it a temporary thing, or is it a real shift that also everyone in the States agrees with, sees?
Would you like to take that, Congressman?
That's a very fair and important question. I think we wouldn't be doing the question justice if we just said the Middle East, because each of the individual problems, in many respects, pose different risks. And so I think we make a mistake if we just say, do we have enough resources to respond to the Middle East? For instance, if Iran were to become a nuclear power and possess nuclear weapons, then the entire balance of power in the world changes overnight in a manner that I think is completely adverse to the interests of the United States, of Europe, of the international order as it stands. And that's not a world that I and most Americans wish to live in. Having said that, do I think that there's a price tag on what America and Europe could offer that will bring a degree of stability to Syria without a whole lot of other things occurring? That's probably wishful thinking. Likewise, Egypt requires enormous economic assistance to develop an economic program to fuel tens of millions of people who have not participated in any type of economic growth for some time. Libya, Yemen, enormous problems. As you rightfully said, a very capable leadership in Jordan that is pressed by refugees and a lack of resources and so forth. On the other hand, however, there are opportunities, and just plucking them out. Israel now, for the first time, becomes the potential exporter of energy. Cyprus, for the first time, becomes, if they can manage this with Turkey and with Greece, you have a potential energy consortium which could actually provide great economic stimulus to the region. If we had capable leaders that were broad-minded, you could envision a scenario where both Israel and a new state of Palestine, if it were to be created, could share in these new energy sources, where they could cooperate with Cyprus, with Turkey, with Greece in a new day in the region, even possibly with Lebanon and Jordan and even Egypt. My only point for raising this in this context is almost any potential positive development unfortunately requires the assistance or engagement of the United States and Europe. The parties, for whatever unfortunate reasons, are for the most part not yet to the point where they can take advantage of it.
But can I take up Rachel's point on this? I mean, you've touched on it, but we're back to the issue of the willpower, and we lost some. It's easier said in retrospect, of course, hindsight, but we lost Syria. We didn't act soon enough. We lost it. And now we're paying, the region is paying a terribly high price because of the escalation of the terrible war there has allowed the entire radicalization of groups there. It is truly tragic. But I wonder, I'm not asking that the United States be the world's police power, and it doesn't want to be. I mean, the public opinion is exhausted from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they can't do it alone, and the Europeans don't want to do it either. And the willpower is very important because the Europeans are losing it. And the Europeans, as you know, most European countries will not embrace hard power. And they believe soft power is a panacea. Well, we know it's not. But I just wonder, when we look at the Middle East, and Russia's a different case, do we actually seriously have the willpower now?
Well, in the United States, as you rightfully say, people are exhausted. But at the same time, people have willpower. They have willpower to defend the interests of the United States and to recognize that allies as well need assistance. And with respect to Europe, and I say this, you said I don't need to be respectful, but I do want to be respectful. I'm an American, I'm not a European. I think many of the opinions, legitimately held opinions that Europeans have, they are able to have them because the United States of America exists. Because there is still the world's single superpower that, while not perfect by any means, engages in the world in a largely constructive, protective way of the way of life of both Europeans and America. If America were to recede in its capability or its willpower, I suspect opinions in Europe would change. Hopefully, America will not recede, but hopefully Europe will begin to play politically and diplomatically and militarily a role that is more equal to its economic position.
It's very interesting, this point. Does anybody want? Yes, please. Please just identify yourself too.
My name is Oliver Tufigny. I'm a freelance journalist. Congressman, you just dismissed Russia's role in the Middle East, sort of like it really can play a constructive role. Yet Russia played a constructive role in the Iran nuclear talks. Russia can play also a constructive role in Syria, despite the blockade in the UN Security Council. And even in the war against terror, against Islamic State terror, you do need Russia because a lot of the fighters, IS terrorists, are from Chechnya and Chechen fighters. So Russia could be very helpful in that. I would like you to comment on Russia's general role in the Middle East, whether you see any room that there could be some sort of cooperation despite the Ukrainian crisis.
Yes, there absolutely could be and is cooperation on several issues. It was demonstrated cooperation with respect to the Syrian chemical weapon program. Clearly, the result or the process never would have occurred without American and Russian collaboration. It probably is fair to say that an Iranian nuclear agreement will not be reached unless Russia plays a constructive role. Unfortunately, I think more often than not, Russia can be more a destructive role as opposed to its capacity to be a constructive role. And part of the objective, part of the challenge for Europe and the United States is to make sure that Russia doesn't play a destructive role. Thankfully, so far, it seems that the United States, Russia, and Europe have been capable enough, forward-thinking enough to compartmentalize our disagreements. And my understanding, at least from an American perspective, is that by and large the Russians have not allowed the Ukrainian situation to creep into the Iranian nuclear weapon discussions, have not allowed it to creep into other aspects of the Middle East. But let's not be naive either. Russia's Putin has a certain set of objectives that are vastly different than the objectives of Europe and the United States. And with all due respect to Russia, you have a nation on the decline. You have a nation whose economy, under any fundamental analysis, is on life support. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not too much. The exact opposite is the case in the United States. Now, we're not celebrating the return of a robust economy yet in America, but probably the best kept secret in the world today is that America's stock markets are at all-time highs. Our economic confidence, after extraordinary setbacks just 6 years ago, is now approaching a degree of healthiness. Who would have thought 5 or 6 years ago that the American economy would be poised to lead the world again. We would have thought it would be China. We might have thought it would be the European Union. We might have thought it would be Brazil or India. But no one would have dreamed that the American economy would be poised to lead the world again. We are. Now, this isn't a question of overconfidence, by no means. Actually, it's just the opposite. We're very deeply concerned that we haven't yet fixed our system to the degree it needs to be fixed, and that people aren't sharing fully in the way that they must share. But the point of this is, we can approach Russia both with a degree of confidence that I don't think most people recognize, but also a realization that the other party on the other side of the table is desperate. And when you're desperate, you do irrational things. We were speaking with some German officials while we were here, and without naming names, one of the things that was said that to me made a tremendous impression was that today's Russia is a little bit different than yesterday's Russia. Why so? Yesterday's Russia, in the midst of the Cold War, was more predictable, or the Soviet Union. It was more predictable. It was rational. Today's Russia, a little bit seemingly irrational. The policy and the practice that they seem to be promoting in Ukraine wouldn't ultimately appear to be in a rational state's interest, but yet they pursue and they double down. Well, that's a scary thought, and the scary thought needs to be reacted from a position, I would argue, of strength, not weakness. And that's going to require willpower in Europe. And I admire Chancellor Merkel's efforts so far. She's been a strong proponent with the United States and with other European allies. But the test for Ukraine, I'm afraid, is still yet to come, the true test. And it's going to require enormous fortitude.
Does anybody want to hop in here? I don't want to hog this. Can I pick you up on Russia, Congressman? Sure. You're completely right about the unpredictability. I mean, the world, when was the world predictable? I mean, the only positive thing about the Cold War was its predictability, what it was based on. But I mean, I'm glad the Cold War is over. But now that we have the violation of borders, of territorial sovereignty, tearing up of the Budapest Memorandum, and the annexation of Crimea, do you, from a transatlantic point of view, do you worry now that the post-Cold War security architecture is more than fraying? It's been completely undermined by what Russia is doing.
I am worried that there is a jeopardy to that infrastructure, but I am actually optimistic that the infrastructure is stronger than ever. Why? Because today it's not just a military infrastructure. It's also a financial infrastructure. And today, Europe and the United States together working collaboratively is more powerful financially through our banking system, through the ability to convert oil revenue into euros or dollars. We have more capacity to influence Russia's economy today than we ever did during the Soviet War, during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Now, that doesn't mean that Putin is going to respond the way that we wish him to, but we actually have more assets to employ that aren't simply military assets, and that, I believe, strengthens our hand rather than weakens it.
The jury's still out on this, of course, because of the unpredictability, and I mean, we've seen what's happening already in eastern Ukraine. But isn't there, I want to go back to this question, because it just doesn't worry the Poles or the Baltic states. I mean, it seriously, absolutely worries the Germans. I mean, the Germans invested how many years of Ostpolitik, Eastern policy with Russia? I mean, they viewed Eastern Europe through the prism of Russia. And the whole, and there was lots of tensions between the United States and Germany over the big energy deals in the 70s. But, I mean, Germany, although it's not fully articulated, Germany existentially now seriously worries that this security architecture is just so brittle that it might just not collapse, but just fray through the unpredictability and get out of control, because we don't, despite what NATO is still there. And I want to go back on this. I'm not entirely convinced that the sanctions and the financial pressure, you say, will be enough to prevent this security architecture from falling and having an all-out conflict. This worries part of the German political class. Did you get this sense when you were talking to officials?
Yes, and I think it's more sophisticated than simple worry. I think there's an analysis of whether or not Germany, Europe, and the United States have the resources and the willpower to put forth the type of effort that's required to defeat whatever it is we deem to be creating the vulnerability or the challenge. But with all due respect, again, to my German friends, that invites the discussion that I so respect is difficult. And that is, how does Germany emerge in a security context, in a military context, from its history in a way that reflects its very important place in the world? And if German officials are so concerned as you say, which I agree with you, then it is past time for the German government and public to have an honest debate about what role Germany must play to confront those worries. And in many respects, Germany has played a very significant role, but in some respects it has been reluctant to do so.
Congressman, what role? In practical terms, or specifically, what role are you thinking about?
Germany needs to have a more robust foreign policy. Now, in fairness, it has expanded its reach very responsibly. It plays a remarkably important role with Iran. It has played different roles with Lebanon and in different scenarios in the Middle East that have been quite significant. The role that Germany has played in certain peacekeeping efforts has been very significant. But we also, looking forward to the next 10 years, to the next 20 years, if we're not just going to rely upon the United States, well, who else are we going to rely upon? Germany is second in line. We're not going to rely upon Russia. We're not going to rely upon China. And Japan has its own issues.
Yes.
So Germany, even if it's more in the context of the leader of Europe, needs to play a more robust role. And you talk rightfully about all these concerns, but those concerns are not necessarily reflected in increased military budgets in Europe. Just the opposite.
Indeed.
At times. So there can't be this mixing.
Yes.
Or there can be, but at least we must recognize that it's not intellectually consistent.
I mean, please.
On your Jan Kahn-Morgan Heike from the Transatlantic Initiative, on your point, which doesn't only reflect in the budget, it also doesn't reflect in the public opinion.
Right.
And you talk about the U.S. being tired, etc. Since decades, all the Pew Research show that Americans not really want to engage so much in international foreign policy anymore. But in Germany, we haven't even been in a position that we had been very involved and engaged. But to the contrary, 3 generations of more or less absence from the global stage. We have a big talk in Berlin in the elite, led by our president, where we have consensus that Germany needs to engage more forcefully globally. In Berlin, in this kind of 3 miles around here, you probably find a lot of people nodding. But don't go to Itzehoe, Munich, Stuttgart or so and talk about global policy there. People are, we export, we are happy. So that's a big challenge for the German government probably.
I wouldn't be so presumptuous to tell German officials how to engage with their public.
Comment to you.
Yes. Yeah, this is a German challenge, and I suspect it will emerge over years, but it's a debate that from what I gather from you and from others, is just beginning. But the world requires that Germany have that debate.
It's very interesting you raise this issue. I don't know if you know where Stuttgart is. And it's known as it is the power engine of the German economy. Actually, Stuttgart is global policy. It should be. Stuttgart, because it's the engine house, it's cars, it's manufacturing. The world is in Stuttgart. Stuttgart exports to the world. Gadgets, they have world market share, which is why Stuttgart should be interested in global power more than Berlin and all the lobbyists. I mean, now, why do I bring up Stuttgart? Because Stuttgart is about keeping trading, commercial shipping lanes open.
Right.
And if Stuttgart can't get its rare earth from Mongolia or Kazakhstan, these lovely democratic countries, as you know, and if they can't keep the Straits of Hormuz open, the German economy will close down,
right.
Which brings in the whole issue of German responsibility.
Right.
And as you know as well as anybody else that the former German president, Horst Köhler, had to resign because he dared mention the dirty word interests. And he said it was Germany's interests. I'm not quoting him entirely verbatim. He said it was Germany. German troops were in the Hindu Kush are going down on in the anti-piracy campaign to protect commercial trading channels. This is the new world order. And it's not just,
It's not the new world order.
Okay,
it's been the world order since the beginning of time.
Yes, actually. Look at the Suez Canal crisis.
Yeah.
Or we can go back further. But
Right.
you see the point I'm making, that
Yes.
this is the German responsibility and they have to recognise this as well.
Well, I agree. And there should be a recognition in Stuttgart that the reason why today their products can flow through the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, is because there's something called the Fifth Fleet of the United States of America that is anchored not too far away. And if it wasn't for the Fifth Fleet of the United States of America, Stuttgart's products wouldn't flow in that strait because it would be closed by a variety of different pressures that would not be favorable to Germany.
Now, we're touching on this issue. Does anybody want to pick up? I mean, we have to send him down to Stuttgart next time he comes. And there's good hotels there.
I can't wait.
Don't worry. It's really, and maybe there'll be a new railway station built in a couple of years' time. That's been blocked. But it's very interesting down there. I'm bringing up Stuttgart and what my friend here raised, the global issue. You see, we're getting into a really fundamental problem, not just for German foreign policy. And by the way, you can criticise Germany for not taking foreign policy responsibility.
I'm not criticizing.
Well, I am.
Okay.
But, which European leader, which European country is thinking strategically at the moment? Very, very few. The bigger, thorniest question I want to look at, we're looking at the Middle East or Russia, sanctions. It's this historical, traditional, unending tension between realpolitik and values. Interests, realpolitik and values. And they will never mesh. They will never come together. In your category, in your how would you call it, your hierarchy, what comes first as a foreign policy analyst of global politics?
I don't agree that they don't come together. They do, or they can come together, but there is an inevitable circumstance where they conflict as well. And that's the art of diplomacy and the art of foreign policy, is balancing interests versus values. For some countries, they apply little or no values. But I, as an American, cannot accept that values do not play a role, and I don't think Europeans either do or should accept that values do not play a role. They do. But in the world of realpolitik, which is the real world, there are interests beyond values, certainly. And to not recognize that or to deny it is absurd. The question is how you balance them.
Heike, please.
Yes. Slight shift of topic, but related. My question is about American politics. I mean, we have talked about the unpredictability of the current Russian politics and all that, but I guess some people here in this country would argue that American politics have also become quite unpredictable. So now we have a Republican-dominated Congress, we have a Democrat administration, 2 more years. What will happen, do you think, in terms of foreign policy of the United States?
Actually, it's a great question.
Yeah.
But America, I would argue, in terms of our politics, is actually not unpredictable. It's actually quite predictable. It's predictable in this sense. On the presidential years, every 4 years, a certain country shows up to vote. And that country votes significantly Democratic. On off-presidential years, which 2014, 2010, it'll happen in 2018, a different country shows up to vote. That country is older, whiter, and to a certain degree more traditional, and in certain areas more affluent. And the result of those elections are vastly different than a presidential election. Now, the Republican Party will seek to change that dynamic in 2 years. I have a bias. I believe they will be unsuccessful. And then it'll be the Democratic Party's challenge 2 years later to change it. But so it is predictable. And the problem for the Republican Party in America is that when most Americans show up to vote, they can't win. The problem for the Democratic Party in America is we can't get most people to show up when there's no president running, and then we can't win. And that's the predictable nature of American politics, that every 2 years we have a dramatic shift. Now, what does that mean for foreign policy? I think it's exaggerated what it means for foreign policy. Most of the impact, I think, is felt in terms of domestic policy. But I also think if we're talking about the current situation, there's this sense that I hear in Europe, oh, Obama's now a lame duck. He just suffered a terrible defeat at the polls. Therefore, he will turn to foreign policy because he's got a Congress that's lined up totally against him on domestic policy. So that's the only area he can exert influence. Wrong. Yes, the president will be focused on ISIS, absolutely. Yes, the president will be focused on the Iranian nuclear weapon quest, absolutely. But the first major decision the president must make is whether or not he will issue executive orders on the issue of immigration. And if he issues those orders, there will be one set of dramatic political consequences. And if he doesn't issue those orders, there will be a whole different set of dramatic political consequences. And so you go almost issue to issue to issue, and the president's, while he may not have cooperation or collaboration with Congress, the domestic policies, I think, for the most part, will garner the most attention. The Republicans have their own stake here, though. I would argue that probably the best thing that happened for Democrats for 2016, and I did not want the Republicans to gain control of the Senate, but probably the best thing that happened to Democrats is that the Republicans gained control of the Senate, because now Republicans are accountable. And if the Congress is viewed by the American people as being do-nothing or obstructionist, the Republicans pay a political price. The flip side is the Republicans now have incentive possibly to compromise with the president because they don't want to be a do-nothing or obstructionist Congress. And that then depends on whether President Obama will follow, for instance, the path that President Clinton often followed in his final years, where he compromised with a Republican Congress even though they were trying to impeach him. He found magical ways to compromise, and that's where there can be, I hope, real benefits for America. But if I was a Republican, I'd be real worried about that dynamic, because history shows us where you have a responsible Congress of another party and they act collaboratively with the president of the other party, the president gets the disproportionate amount of the credit. So if you have collaboration and compromise, the Republicans will be doing the right thing for the country, and I will applaud them as being patriotic, extraordinary Americans, but they probably won't benefit at the polls to the degree that they would wish.
Oh, that was a terrific analysis of it. I mean, I was reminded during it was such an appalling campaign over the last couple months in the United States. I mean, it was a pig that made the headlines more than the growing employment and the health reform and immigration is extraordinary. In any case, let me follow you up on this, Republicans. I mean, there's actually interesting sense in Europe that maybe TTIP will be accelerated because of the Republicans now.
Right.
Do you see this as a real possibility?
I hope so. I hope so. I hope that'll be the case for the trade agreements in Europe. I hope that it'll be the trade agreements in Asia.
Yeah.
That would provide enormous boost to the world economy. And it is true. It frees up the president a little bit. And hopefully the Republicans, because they by and large agree wholeheartedly with the policy, will see a way to move forward. Yeah, every crisis has an opportunity, and every defeat also has an opportunity. And yes, it should speed it up. Hopefully it will.
On the question of it, I was reminded by Obama's extraordinarily warm reception in China. There was Putin and Obama and the Chinese leadership, and Putin gave this really boring speech, please invest in my country. And you know, it was a very small audience, nobody was taking the pictures of him. And when Obama got to the stage, he was a hero. And it wasn't because of, he's the United States president, but it's still, and I actually have to agree with you here, it's what America represents to the outside world, to the Chinese particularly. How many people go there to study and they want to send their children there. Do you think that the Obama administration, leaving aside what is going on with the existence of Guantanamo Bay, the death penalty, the whole issue of immigration, the whole issue of trying to reorder the internet, does America still represent this bounty, unbounded freedom and values? Do you think that's the perception when you travel still?
The short answer is yes. But that doesn't mean that America always gets it right. It means still that America must improve. It means that America must be humble enough to listen, particularly to our friends. America must be nimble enough to change when we aren't doing the right thing. And we too have our own balancing act. You know, 9/11 was as traumatic an event as a nation could incur and suffer from. We suffered. And as a result, we adopted policies that at the time, and to a certain extent still, make sense to protect the homeland. However, I think even the most strident right-of-center politician in America would recognize that you can go too far. And there is this constant debate in America, security versus personal freedom. And that same debate occurs in Europe, although I think sometimes a bit more or less honest.
I think you're
At least
about Snowden.
Yeah, at least in America, we, I think, understand what we're sacrificing, and we are honest about that sacrifice. It doesn't mean we get the balance right. But what sometimes I worry about in Europe, not in England, I think they get this just right, or even go a bit, well, they get it right.
You were going to say something else, though. What
well,
did you say? Over the top? No.
Well, no, it just, I mean, they've accepted a degree of intrusion onto their privacy by cameras and technology and so forth for a sense of security, and I respect that. At the same time, I think we all need to understand the devastation, both physically and psychologically, that terror takes. And it's so easy when we forget what the ramifications of terror are to relax those standards, and I think that's very dangerous.
Heike, you want to come in here? Anybody want to take up any of these? I mean, these are really big issues for the whole transatlanticism. Can I just go slightly back on TTIP, because the clock is ticking away for TTIP,
Sure.
actually. Some analysts say, let me put this in a nutshell. I actually, if I'm allowed to say so, not with due respect, I actually think the old transatlantic relationship is over. And I'm very pleased it is, because it was based on the Cold War, and it was based on a dependence, and America would always look after us. We're still not looking after our own security, by the way, and we still look to the Americans. I mean, intellectually and politically, we don't want to recognize this. And we have to reframe the transatlantic relationship in new structures. But do you think if TTIP was concluded, would this actually reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship, restore or boost the new Western liberal order?
Yes. And let me respond to that from an American perspective.
Yes, please.
The thing that thrilled me so much when President Obama offered this idea, I think it was at a State of the Union address, it was the first time I had heard an American president in years talk about Europe in a positive light. Because what did we Americans hear month after month after month? Europe doesn't have a defense budget. Europe isn't taking its fair share of this burden or that. Europe's problems in Greece, Europe's problems in here are dragging us down. Whatever it was, Europe was a negative story for years in the United States. For the first time, a president was talking about how engaging with Europe wasn't just a matter of our protection, it was a matter of mutual benefit. So I agree with you. From an American perspective, this reframes the transatlantic relationship, but I don't think it suggests that it's over.
That's you have to come back to answer this.
Okay, fair deal.
Transatlantic talks are scheduled for 60 minutes. It's been 60 minutes of terrific conversation. Thank you so much, Congressman Wexler. Thank you so much, Judy Dempsey. This was very good. Thank you, and please join me in clapping my hands.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frau Rosen. Thank you.